So I thought that I would start with by looking at a couple texts that I could read with you and comment on with you. I have two in particular that I want to begin with. And one is this little, it's called Note. This is from the Infinite Conversation. And just to tell you how I'm going to proceed today, the second is this little narrative called The Madness of the Dead. But the note is, I think, of particular interest because it gives us a way of talking about his course of thinking. This is a little, excuse me, it's 2 pages in the French text, which, if my memory serves me well, appear in the table of contents. And the reason I make that, what would seem an obvious statement, is that what follows this note is a dialogue, which you have in what follows in your in this little set of photocopies. That dialogue introduces the Infinite Conversation. And the whole text, which is about 500 and some pages, echoes it, that dialogue constantly. But the dialogue itself does not appear in the table of contents. It's not in the book in a strict sense. So each of these are sort of liminal texts which appear at the opening of this rather extraordinary collection of essays, which was published in 1969, called The Infinite Conversation. One is in it's a kind of theoretical statement. The other is, we'd have to describe it as a piece of writing with a strong narrative dimension. And this is characteristic of the Infinite Conversation in that it is constantly juxtaposing reflection with statements with conversations of a narrative character or a literary character. And this sort of sets the problem of the text, how we are to negotiate these different genres or these different forms of writing, and the fact that when the literary writing itself is fundamentally fragmentary. It's the whole text in that sense becomes fragmented by virtue of this fragmentation of the literary text in relation to the more theoretical text. And that introduces some very interesting, very important problems. But let me simply start with this note with you and look at how he's describing the place from which the writings in the Infinite Conversation comes. And I'll just read it with you because, as I said, I don't expect you to have studied this. Certainly there are always books published in every country and in every language, some of which are taken as critical works or works of reflection, while others bear the title of novel and others call themselves poems. It is probable that such designations will endure, just as there will still be books a long while after the concept of book is exhausted. Still, this remark must be made. Since Mallarmé, reducing the latter to a name and the name to a reference point, what has tended to render such distinctions sterile is that by way of them, and more important than they are, there has come to light the experience of something one continues to call, but with a renewed seriousness, and moreover in quotation marks, literature. Essays, novels, poems seem only to be there and to be written in order to allow the labor of literature, now considered as a singular force or a position of sovereignty, to accomplish itself. And through this labor to allow formulation of the question, what would be at stake in the fact that something like art or literature exists? This question is extremely pressing and historically pressing. I refer here to certain texts of The Space of Literature and Le Livre à Venir, as well as to the pages entitled Literature and the Right to Death, but it is a question that a secular tradition of aestheticism has concealed and continues to conceal. I find that question there to be extremely fruitful. What would be at stake in the fact that something like art or literature exists? French did it. The French gives it a slightly more subjunctive term. What would be in the statement that something like literature should exist? And the suggestion being that if there is something like this thing that he designates in quotation marks, this would raise essential questions for let's just say the symbolic sphere within which it happens, right? And within the language in which it happens. If something like literature exists, then we have to think about language differently. And we have to think about language and politics, language and thought, language and science, and so on and so forth. If there is something like literature, in a very strong sense he wants to designate, then we have to rethink the space of symbolic production as a whole. He's of course taking off from Mallarmé, who very coyly says, well, we've been fooling around with verse when he talks about his writing. But enters a practice of writing which is a very intense engagement with the question of language in relation to some of the philosophical reflections of the 18th and 19th century. In Mallarmé's case, particularly with Hegel, but there's a way in which in engaging Hegel, Mallarmé is also engaging all of the important thinking about language of the previous century. I would like this afternoon to take a look at the text Literature and the Right to Death, and you also have a photocopy of that. And that text is too big to comment on at long length, and it's too much for you to have read. It would have been impossible to read that carefully last night. So I'm going to look at certain sections of it and try to talk about what he is pointing to here with the question of language and literary practice. But he is suggesting that he is claiming that something is happening to literary thought in the 19th century, and that the question of literature is emerging with Mallarmé in a way that it has not been present before. Someone like Benjamin will come along and say, well, that's not quite true. It happens with Hölderlin and Romanticism, and one can be dated in various ways, and I think Blanchot would be very comfortable with that. But he is very much situating himself within his own tradition here with reference to Mallarmé. Okay, continuing. I will not say that we have gotten past this moment. This would have scarcely any meaning. Whatever we do, whatever we write, and the magnificent surrealist experience has shown this, literature takes possession of it, and we are still in the civilization of the book. Notice he doesn't use the quotation marks in this case, and he's recognizing implicitly that in this emergence of literature, or literature without quotation marks, there's nevertheless still a very strong, let's just say, ideological baggage. The idea of literature is still at work in the sense that it is informed by the notion of the book, to which he'll come back. And this is something that, in a certain sense, he suffered throughout his career. That as much as he tries to take a course of anonymity and to disperse the literary production, that created, in his case, a kind of mystifying effect. He became more and more of a literary author the more he challenged these ideas of literature. And it's the hold of letters in the French tradition was enough to always complicate this project. Yet, literary work and research, let us keep this qualifying adjective, contribute to an unsettling of the principles and the truths that are sheltered by literature. In correlation with certain possibilities offered by knowledge, by discourse, and by political struggle. And let me just pause over there. Knowledge, discourse, and political struggle. Here, Blanchot is implicitly situating his work in relation to what we have come to call poststructuralism. He is thinking, he's thinking of individuals like Althusser, and in relation to political struggle, Althusser, and at the same time Sartre, and some of the initiatives that he attempted to do with Sartre. With knowledge, he's thinking about anthropology. He's thinking about Lévi-Strauss. He's thinking about Lacou-Labarthe. He's talking about an endeavor in post-war French thinking to establish what the French called les sciences humaines, sciences of men. And this endeavor is an effort to provide a kind of total account of human social beings, social and how can I say? It takes into account paleontology and anthropology and all dimensions of the human. It is it's a magnificent project, really. I mean, look at the work of people like Lévi-Strauss or Lacou-Labarthe. It's breathtaking and very exciting, the sweep of thinking. At the same time, it takes into account the sciences, mathematics, René Thom and others. It's Michel Serres is very much in that tradition. It takes into account reflection on art and psychoanalysis, psychology, Freud. It's a general. I don't want to say general theory, although each of these figures were in some sense elaborating sort of general accounts of human existence. But it covers the field of human experience. And I have to say, if you look at the work of people like Foucault or Althusser or Deleuze and Derrida, against that backdrop, you appreciate all the more what post-structuralism meant, this challenge to a scientific undertaking. But at the same time, you realize just what kind of breadth was in Foucault's reference to something like the episteme, the order of knowledge. It's something that I think it was lost in the emergence of the field of theory in the 80s and 90s, particularly as it veered into cultural studies. There was a kind of a shortening of perspective that occurred in relation to the breadth of thinking and the breadth of inquiry and research that was going on in this post-war period. And I've often, I've wanted to try to figure out how could one re-engage that breadth. How could one really honor that cross-disciplinary initiative and reach. It was really, as I say, it was really quite exciting, and we see it today. I mean, we see it in these different authors to some extent, and if you're a reader of Michel Serres, you have a quite exciting relation to the history of thinking in mathematical thinking, and some of these authors are referring to French experimentation in music. It is a really very exciting breadth of vision, but somehow, in my experience anyway, in theoretical studies, that breadth has been pulled in. The perspectives have closed to some extent. But anyway, it's in that context that Blanchot is situating his work. So, in correlation with certain possibilities by knowledge, by discourse, and by political struggle, this labor has caused to emerge, although not for the first time, in as much as repetition, the eternal going over again is its very origin, but rather in a more insistent manner, and as affirmed in these works, the question of language. And again, all of these writers, thinkers, scientists in the French context in which Blanchot was working, were also reading phenomenology, Husserl and Heidegger in particular. And Heidegger had, of course, introduced the question of language. Some of them were reading authors such as Wittgenstein and the analytic philosophers. And so the question of language, which emerged in the 20th century in philosophy in Europe, throughout Europe, was also informing this scientific undertaking in the post-war period. And, as you probably know, Claude Lévi-Strauss put the question of language right at the heart of this effort to found a new human sciences on a structural basis. So structural linguistics became a kind of point science for this. It was offering some of the fundamental tools for bringing Lévi-Strauss's anthropological research into form, into a precisely scientific form, and for Lacan was also extremely attentive to trying to think of a linguist. This is a real lapse. Saussure, attending to Saussure in thinking about the structuring of the unconscious as a language and so forth. So structural linguistics became, as I say, a kind of point science, a point of reference with its theoretical tools. And this was helping to bring a scientific form to the kind of questioning about language that Heidegger had introduced. And in this respect, the later Heidegger was as important in France as the earlier Heidegger. The earlier Heidegger being the Heidegger of being in time and the existential analytic, the later Heidegger being the thinker about art and language. So, this labor has caused to emerge, although not for the first time, but rather in a more insistent manner, and has affirmed in these works the question of language. Then, through the question of language, the question that perhaps overturns it, and comes together in a word that today is apparently and easily accepted, even rendered ordinary, but that only a few dozen years ago, in its neutral simplicity, was considered nearly unreasonable, even the most unreasonable. Writing, this mad game of writing, ce jeu insensé d'écrire. The interesting statement there. Blanchot was very open to Derrida, and to Derrida's introduction of this theme of writing. And as he's very open to the way in which this was taken up, particularly in a French context, in the 60s. But it's particularly striking in this in his turn of phrase here that he suggests that, well, we were talking about writing 30 years ago. This is 1969. So 1939, talking about writing. I'm not entirely sure what he's saying at this point. I'm puzzled by this. If you look at Blanchot's really quite moving and beautiful reading of Bataille in The Infinite Conversation, and I'm afraid the title is escaping me right now. It's experiences in the title. I'm sorry? Well, it's about the inner experience, among other things. But I'm sorry, it's halfway through The Infinite Conversation. It's a big essay. It's a very powerful essay. And it starts from an attention to the way Bataille spoke, the way he used language in an oral context. And that's striking in itself, because Blanchot very much focuses on writing and literature. But he makes a very strong statement about the peculiar character of Bataille's use of language, and the way in which he called to attention his interlocutor with his language, and called to this other space that Blanchot is himself attempting to explore in The Infinite Conversation. And so when he's talking about Bataille's thinking and use of language, he makes a turn in which he says, I want to really come to grips with what, or to try to come to grips with what was happening in Bataille's work. I think we have to really introduce the question of writing, and of writing in the strong and strict sense. And so he's clearly, at this point, I mean, I'm trying to date this, right? 30 years before 1969 is 1939. So we're right around the time of the war. Whom is he thinking at this moment? It's a very curious statement. Who else could it be but Bataille? And in that moment, he is chatting or talking with Bataille about the inner experience, about the experience of Acéphale, that strange project that they had of another community. And as he says in his essay on Bataille, in order to understand this, we have to understand this in terms of the form of writing. So Blanchot must have been introducing writing in 1939 in the conversations with Bataille and those circles. And so this must be in that context already a very charged reference. But maybe someone else can do more with this than I can, but I find this a very striking suggestion that he was introducing the question of writing in 1939.
I think the sentence "writing," quote, "this mad game of writing," that's like so close to Nietzsche or Georges Bataille's book, like Sir Nietzsche on Nietzsche, because Georges Bataille, I like this formulation very much. Georges Bataille says, "What forces me to write, I suppose, is the fear of going mad."
Yes.
So it's sort of like this exigency that forces him to write.
But I think that Blanchot, my point here, and I'm completely with you, but just why I was taking the tack I was taking there just a moment ago, is to say that Blanchot seems to be suggesting that Bataille was struggling with the idea of writing itself in terms of his own project, and that Bataille's was the inner experience was really a form of experience, and that writing would be almost a falling away from that in this construction. And Blanchot was bringing it home constantly that writing is absolutely essential to this. Now, in what you're citing from Nietzsche, that's implied, and Blanchot would have been bringing that out.
If you look at the work that Bataille was doing at that time, and for me, like taking the question of writing and a confusion, a certain disavowal, or
yes,
a struggle with writing, I think one might follow the tack that you were taking up by looking at documents, looking at the magazine that he was working on at that time. There's a kind of a resistance there. There's a kind of, in my way of thinking about it, there's a kind of engagement with a para-literature, or the thought of a para-literature that occurs for me.
Yes. There's the Collège de Sociologie, which is involved in, and there's Saas-Fee, clandestine activities, meetings, literary meetings, and again, right at the beginning of the war, very charged context. This history is still to be written, very much to be written and to be understood. He continues, writing. The exigency of writing. This is a very important motif in Blanchot. I was talking about the exigency that occurs in art for Heidegger last week. So just for those who were in that conversation, there's a link here. But Blanchot, when Blanchot talks about the event of writing, the event of writing in the sense that, and he says this in the Le Pas au-delà, the Step Not Beyond, and he evokes this several times. He talks about a beginning of the task of writing, and in that beginning, the opening of a need to write and a demand to carry out this act of writing. So this theme of an exigency is that there is something in writing that requires this devotion that he's describing. And I'll come back to this, but it's a very important thing. Writing, the exigency of writing, no longer the writing that has always, through a necessity in no way avoidable, been in the service of the speech or thought that is called idealist, that is to say moralizing, but rather the writing that through its own slowly liberated force, the aleatory force of absence, seems to devote itself solely to itself as something that remains without identity, and little by little brings forth possibilities that are entirely other, an anonymous, distracted, deferred, and dispersed way of being in relation, by which everything is brought into question. And first of all, the idea of God, of the self, of the subject, then of truth, and the one, then finally the idea of the book and the work. So that this writing, understood in its enigmatic rigor, far from having the book as its goal, rather signals its end. A writing that could be said to be outside discourse, outside language. He's describing a movement as the question of language emerges in the 20th century. And if we think, I was talking about this a little bit in Heidegger, but we see this in other authors. The way in which language seems to, through the literary enterprise and even through some thinking, seems to become, to remove itself, and we'll find someone like Heidegger saying that language, die Sprache spricht, language speaks. And we have to understand the peculiar way in language, the way in which language reflects itself or turns in upon itself. We have to think the peculiar presence of language is one that withholds itself or withdraws into a kind of self-relation. You see this in Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge when he tries to bring forth the idea of the énoncé. And he says, language has this peculiar being. It is independent unto itself. It's not like other things. As I mentioned Foucault, because he's a rather radical thinker, but nevertheless who's bringing forth this trait of language that Heidegger had tried to bring forth. A sense in which language is, in some sense, referring to itself constantly, and withdrawing or withholding from the communicative relation as it's understood in normal everyday usage. The communicative relation being, one in which language is simply a tool, which, in some sense, effaces itself once the act of designating a thing or signified for another human being. Once that act has occurred, language is in some sense exhausted. But in this reflection on language that happens in the 20th century, language becomes more opaque, takes on its own thingly presence, and various authors begin to think about the peculiar relationality of language in relation to itself. And so, when he evokes this writing, it's almost as though language is beginning to write itself in some sense in literary experimentation, and to take on this peculiar identity. But it's an identity without identity, as he puts it. And as this is explored, and this is really describing in some sense his own trajectory. He describes in The Space of Literature and in the book to come a literary practice whereby there is this that seems a kind of it seems like an isolated practice or an isolating practice, and the book withdraws into its own space. The space of literature is a removed space in relation to other social forms. But as this experimentation goes on, it breaks up more and more into and breaks up with it the hold of the entire symbolic order, and with these defining concepts: God, self, subject, truth, and one, all of which are devoted to this gathering of meaning within a totalizing field. Of course, that whether we think of that through a Heideggerian way or we think of it in a Hegelian way, the project is one of a totalizing of meaning which absorbs the entire movement of spirit and history.
Could you say something about why those totalizing ideas, God, self, subject, why they're necessarily or more associated with speech as opposed to writing?
Well, I think they...
Or why they have
well, it's language. And the reason I stress language is that, when Derrida brings out the question of writing, he's bringing out something that Heidegger had already brought out, as we were seeing last week, with the idea of this, this constant reference to tracing, the Elfis and so forth, and the materiality of language that Heidegger was trying to draw our attention to. But I think that, whether language or writing, writing simply names a very radical engagement with this dimension of language, and it comes out whether it's it's Lacan thinking about the signifier and the letter, or Foucault with his énoncé, or Derrida with writing. In each of these cases, they're talking about this peculiar character of language in referring to itself in a way,
and it's also liberating more in a way that speech can be.
Yes.
Seems to be implying that.
Speech very quickly evokes for us a voice and a presence of the self to itself. And if we just follow Derrida's critique of metaphysics, it is from Plato forward, the voice seems to secure a sense of presence to self, and in a certain sense, the way in which it is mobilized in philosophy is to secure that presence. To assert the immediacy of the thinking and the thought to the subject of that thinking. Whereas with writing, writing introduced. Plato was himself quite nervous about writing, precisely because writing in writing there's a kind of there's a presence that's not a living presence of an intentional subject, and writing seems to pursue its own existence, and so Plato describes it as a kind of bastard running around without a name and without being able to speak for itself. You ask what a written text is saying, and all it can do is repeat itself. There's a kind of a dead presence there.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, a disruption of the notion of the self and also the truth and the one, because it's impossible to secure the meaning when you have this this iterability or repeatability of the signifier, or the trace, taken into consideration. So the more this reflection on language proceeds, the more it disrupts these fundamental concepts. And so he's describing an ongoing practice whereby this thinking that, as I was saying before, sweeps over the whole of human experience to give us the idea of something like les sciences humaines, human sciences. Taken together, as he said, with political work, artistic work, work in discourse, all of this leads to a process whereby the possibility of an episteme starts to break up. It is, and poststructuralism really is the thought of the disruption of any founded knowledge and any totalizing knowledge regarding human experience and, we might say, social, or the symbolic sphere. So he's describing, he's giving us a quick lesson in the advent of poststructuralism in these paragraphs, and in that respect I think it's especially powerful. Again, what is at stake for the fact that something like literature or art should exist? If it exists, all this follows. Is sort of what he's suggesting. Yet another word of elucidation or obfuscation. When I speak of the end of the book, or better, the absence of the book, I do not mean to allude to developments in the audiovisual means of communication with which so many experts are concerned. If one ceased publishing books in favor of communication by voice, image, or machine, this would in no way change the reality of what is called the book. Again, the question is how meaning is totalized, or organized, or networked. On the contrary, language, like speech, would thereby affirm all the more its predominance and its certitude of a possible truth. In other words, the book always indicates an order that submits to unity, a system of notions in which are affirmed the primacy of speech over writing, of thought over language, and the promise of a communication that would one day be immediate and transparent. Now, it may be that writing requires the abandonment of all of these principles. That is to say, the end and also the coming to completion of everything that guarantees our culture. Not so that we might in idyllic fashion turn back, but rather so we might go beyond, that is, to the limit, in order to attempt to break the circle of circles, the totality of the concepts that founds history, that develops in history, and whose development history is. And this is really indicates to us that Hegel is the real challenge in this period. Hegel, in the sense that he offers the thought of a totalizing movement, which would be history itself, and in this period after. What's with me today? The Russian Kojev. Kojev had been Alexander Kojev had been lecturing in the 30s on Hegel, and he presented a thought of the end of history, that Hegel would have thought history in its entirety, and presented it in thought, in a book of sorts, in the book, in the Logic, and this for this struggle that Blanchot is naming, this effort to think language, think writing, think these disruptions of these guiding ideas, Hegel's totalizing project is, in some respects, the real challenge, and the question of dialectic, the way language is thought in relation to the dialectical movement that Hegel had given us. That's why last night I was, so insistently trying to demarcate Blanchot's thinking about language from the employment of the negative in dialectic, and the understanding of language from that notion of an employment of the negative.
Is there any reference at all to the eternal return, or is it strictly Hegel here?
Look, we saw a reference to the return in the second paragraph when he referred to repetition, the eternal going over again. That's for him. That's Blanchot's ressassement éternel. So that's sort of a turning Nietzschean phrase. Well, he would say that as this movement and exploration of language and writing is occurring, then there's more and more of an exposure to Nietzsche's thinking of the return. And in Blanchot's own work, that really comes forward in the Power de la, which is not until the early 70s. It's there, and he's talking about Nietzsche quite a lot in the 60s. And I think he's doing it pretty much in the context of Foucault's work and Deleuze's work in particular, and Klossowski. But, in some respects, Nietzsche's thinking was late in coming in Blanchot's thinking. But the necessity of thinking something like the return comes to him as he's working through this theoretical project that he's describing in a quasi-narrative form for us. Of course, the return disrupts narrative, but he's quite attentive to it. The circle of circles, that would be the one most immediately drawn in Hegel's thinking. Writing in this sense, in this direction in which it is not possible to maintain oneself alone, a very important statement. This is an experience of anonymity and plurality, an essential plurality. There can be no subject of this project that he's describing, or this research that he's describing. He sometimes uses that word. This has to be thought in a plurality, and hence the question of community. Though at this point he's very wary of the word community because it so easily induces a more traditional notion of communion or joining into some form of unity. He wants to think dispersion, a more nomadic form, a more plural form, a more multiple form, and so forth. But we cannot think this as the work of one alone. It's necessary to think relationality differently. So, Reading, in this direction in which it is not possible to maintain oneself alone, or even in the name of all, without the tentative advances, the lapses, the turns and detours, experimentation, fragmentation, error, a certain amount of silliness. Genuine experimentation, because the telos is no longer there. Right? The direction is no longer there in the sense of an orientation. The capacity to orient oneself in relation to the past, and in the sense that the past would be gathering through some progression into a realization. All of that is being destroyed. And so consequently, it's a practice without a determinable future, without orientation, and consequently full of error, full of misdirection. So let me just read, carrying forward. In this direction, which it is not possible to maintain oneself alone, or even in the name of all, without the tentative advances, lapses, turns, and detours, whose trace the text here brought together bear. And their interest, I believe, lies in this. So he recognizes immediately that the infinite conversation is a very heteroclite assembly. Some of it is working better than other parts. Some of it is really marking. Some of it is perhaps a bit of a detour. He's very, very explicit about that. All of this, writing in this sense, supposes a radical change of epoch. Interruption, death itself, or to speak hyperbolically, the end of history. There is really in this time, in France in particular, in this post-structural moment, a sense of a revolutionary event. And I had the great privilege of, in 1985, I was teaching in Strasbourg, and I taught the Introduction to Modern Philosophy course, which was a very great honor for me because I knew that both Levinas and Blanchot had taken this course. So, okay, this is really, to teach that course is really, this is it. And I taught Derrida, and I was the first lecturer in Strasbourg ever to teach a living author in that course. It had never been done before, which I thought was a rather curious fact. But anyway, and I introduced the course. I remember this very distinctly. A little bit to the surprise of the students. They were quite taken. I said, "Are you aware that there has been a revolution in this country in the last couple decades?" And I was referring to since the 60s, but I was referring to 68, of course. But I was also referring to the intellectual revolution, and it really did seem to me, and it's always seemed to me, that something happened in France, in around 68 and in the years that followed it, as they tried to make sense of this event. Something happened for which the names that I've been alluding over and over are absolutely crucial. Lacan, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, and others. We have a way of reducing that field too much by this set of master names. But But there was an event, and it's hard to account for this extraordinary productivity on part of these individuals, this extraordinary creativity, unless we see this as happening in a context where there is they are not working alone. However much we admire the singularity of a particular path of thinking, we cannot think that without this relationality that Blanchot is evoking here. And there is a sense that this is a new time, or the question of a new time has opened. And of course, this is Heidegger had announced the end of philosophy pretty much near the before the end of the 20s, and going into the 1930s. So this is not a new motif, the idea of the end of history. The necessity of ending philosophy, in ending the project of metaphysics as it had been laid out since Plato and Aristotle, and suggesting that this had exhausted itself, in some sense, once it came to the 20th century, and that it was time for a passage to a new beginning, as Heidegger put it, a new articulation of our position in history. Blanchot writes quite insistently about this motif of a change of epoch, in the sense that perhaps our relation to time itself must be rethought, and there has to be a kind of radical break with the thinking which belongs to the past. In 1958, I'm going to come to this tomorrow probably. Blanchot published a little statement with the title "Refusal." I was talking about refusal last night, but he published it, and I think I alluded to this statement in particular. But he says very explicitly, "I reject everything of the past and everything of the present." So everything of the present, which is pretty much shaped by the past, it is a refusal of everything given, and he's really quite serious. I think this must be destroyed in the Heideggerian sense, or the Derridean sense, in the sense of deconstructed or destructed, undone, in order to allow a passage to a different thought of time and experience. So he's trying to write the end of history. I mean, Benjamin had been doing something like this too. When his theses on history, when he talks about in the Arcades project, he starts talking about constellations of time and the necessity of thinking, necessity of writing in the present from a relation to the past, which involves what he calls a weak messianic power. And this is an extraordinarily revolutionary articulation of thinking history, or I think you have to say, following Benjamin, writing history. And it is, it's also introduces a kind of fragmentation that is consonant with what we're reading here. So I think it is, it's a very radical understanding of the relation to time and history. And I'm coming close to the end now, we'll have a break. Writing in this way passes through the advent of communism, recognized as the ultimate affirmation, communism being still always beyond communism. So, very interesting that he names this. He gives a political reference to this advent of another time and this relationality, this other relationality, which he has been alluding to in various ways with notions of fragmentation, interruption, and also the idea of not being able to do this alone. And he thus concludes, writing thus becomes a terrible responsibility. Invisibly, writing is called upon to undo the discourse in which, however unhappy we believe ourselves to be, we who have it at our disposal remain comfortably installed. From this point of view, writing is the greatest violence, for it transgresses the law, every law, and also its own. So you have, this statement will be taken up very strongly in Lacou-Labarthe, which is a book about transgression, and it's constantly about the question of law and order. We'll see this. I want to go in the next half of this session after the break. We'll see this in the madness of the day already, in the late 40s. But Blanchot is really quite violent, I think, in this respect. He is constantly pushing to the limits and trying to breach those limits. And for him, this is transgression in the strongest sense. It's about law, it's about justice, about the right, and about dissidence also. So, I think this is a text that repays attention, and it's just a beautiful evocation of his understanding of the movement by which his own research proceeds.